I'm recording now. I mean, you can talk about whatever you want. It just might end up on YouTube.
I just never really cared.
Okay, so I'm going to open this in Sketchbook Pro, and sorry you guys all have to like look over my shoulder. The nice thing about Sketchbook and Photoshop is that they... Just kidding. Usually they play nice with one another. Did it not open? Let's try this. Kate practice. There we go. Okay. So it looks like it turned on all of the things at once. Okay, I'm glad this happened. So it looks like masks in Photoshop, and I kind of forgot about this, because there isn't masking in Sketchbook, don't translate. So what I'm going to have to do first is, when you guys are in Photoshop, you have to save it as a like not layered file. Save a copy. You could save it. Well, I'll show you a couple ways. You could flatten the image and just save it as a Photoshop file, because Sketchbook likes Photoshop files also. That's probably what I would do. If not, if you want just like a regular image file, I would do a PNG. Okay. PNGs like don't have lossy compression, and they don't degrade over time. And just in general, like Photoshop and PNG is good for almost everything.
Hey Ty, previously today, did you see Scooter's on the Trizon?
Oh yeah.
Good.
This is great. When in doubt, open it twice. Okay. So, wow. Where are my layers? Okay, so I'm gonna just like right click on my layers and flatten the image, which shouldn't change how it looks here. And then I'm going to save a copy of this. Like, definitely don't accidentally save over your working file, so this is going to be flattened. And that way I can bring it into Sketchbook. You can also go in and just like flatten all the layers that have masks. And that way you still have layers you can play around with in Sketchbook. Whatever that. The interesting stuff in Sketchbook has more to do with like the brushwork. So I think we're good. I'm going to get out of this and open this in Sketchbook, maybe. Okay. Okay, what were we talking about doing? Sketching over top, and there was like something. Oh, okay. So there are a bunch of things you can do here. One thing I like to use Sketchbook for are like making up fake highlights. So like on the glasses here, you can't really tell that they're really shiny. They're green, but we kind of lost some of that definition during like the coloring and adding transparency back in. So I'm gonna make a new layer and find a nice like soft brush and pick a white color and change the size a little bit and just like see, okay, so that's right. And I forget like all where my buttons are here. Okay. So I'm gonna do like maybe some highlights, and I like to use a soft brush for doing hard highlights because it's a combination with that and a hard eraser that gives you like a nice clean line. And maybe I want that to be something like that. My workflow in Sketchbook Pro involves a lot of erasing, at least initially. So if that's something you're not used to or familiar with already, you will be. Alright, so I'm going to use a soft eraser and just like back that down a little bit. And like, where is this light coming from? I don't know, but I just want it to look like a little bit more shiny in there. I might turn down the opacity a little bit and then hit some of these areas that like there shouldn't be shiny, and maybe I even like overshoot a little bit because it looks like maybe something else is like interrupting that highlight. So this is where, like, if you have a reference of some other highlight somewhere else, you can make it look more real, and sometimes you just have to play with this a little bit until you get something to look right. You know, like duplicate it and make the fade a little bit more extreme. Maybe I'll add... You could also, if you want, use like a harder brush. That's much too hard, much too small. And then like back your transparency way down, and you can get sort of the same idea. Generally, with highlights, if you have, like in this case, I have the sort of like the white plastic part of the glasses hovering on top of this green lens, so you'll want to make sure there's some sort of gap in whatever highlights that you add between those two, because technically whatever mythical light is creating these highlights, it would be blocked probably by those other plastic parts. So anyway, I'm just going to move on. I'm not entirely happy with that, but it looks like it's a little bit more shiny. I'm going to do...
Do you ever use clown patches in sketchbook?
You can. Yeah, because you can still select, I think you can still select colors in Sketchbook. It's just a different workflow. Usually if I'm doing that kind of like hard selection of things, I do it in Photoshop. It just is easier. I know the tools better for that. And I think there's just more you can do with, I mean, the biggest advantage of using a clown pass in Photoshop is the fact that you can use it as a mask, and there just isn't masking yet in Sketchbook Pro. So, I don't know, you can try. I might add, like, find another reason to do some sort of shiny thing on this other lens. Like, maybe we can do something like that. That looks kind of gross. But maybe it's okay for now. Alright, I'm just going to leave it for now. They look a little shinier than they used to. Right? Off, on, a little shinier. Yes, you could use like your Chrome Pass in Photoshop to bring these kinds of highlights back in too. There were a lot of extraneous highlights and things in that Chrome Pass, so sometimes it's like only good as a reference and you can kind of take it in after the fact. Okay, one highlight I know I wanted to add was I really like how this highlight happened on this temple here, and the Chrome Pass wasn't giving me one on this other temple, but that's something I can totally like fake in. So I could use like a hard white brush and just add something, go back and erase away any parts I didn't like. Right, it's a subtle change, but I think it helps. I also tend to like merge my layers pretty often, just because it's easy to make a change, and if you don't like it, delete it and just draw it again. I will try and keep all of my like highlights together in one layer, and that way I can always like turn them on and off and that kind of thing. Another thing I might do is I kind of wish I had some more definition in the top edge up here. Like this shadow down underneath the foam looks pretty good, but it didn't really carry through up top here. So I'm going to do one more highlight layer up there. All right, so I kind of added a lot more white below it because I knew that I was going to come back and like erase up to that line that kind of comes through. Might have to come back through and kind of tone it down a little bit too. Okay, so like again, one more like really subtle change, but it helps add some more definition to the top up there. So I'll add it to my highlights. Okay, so you could spend all day adding highlights and shadows and stuff like that. So let's try a shadow really quick. To add a shadow, you could paint with like a really dark, well, I'll show you, like if you use a really dark brush, you could like paint over something and do the same process, like erase away from it, and you have your shadow. Usually it kind of like muddies things up though, so newer versions of Sketchbook will let you do the same sort of layer effects as Photoshop has, and using a multiply usually does a better job with shadow than just using a dark brush by itself. So
you don't use any layers for highlights, right?
I didn't do any like layer effects. You could, if you wanted, you could do like a lighten or a, what's the other one, like any of these light ones, overlay, soft light, hard light. In general, it's pretty much the same though, unless you have a color underneath that you're trying not to mess with. Just regular white is fine. This is all gray. Another reason I like working with gray. All right, so I am going to do a quick multiply layer with like a slightly less dark brush to kind of exaggerate the difference between the front and the back of this here. Yeah, and you can already see, like compared to Photoshop, where you can just easily mask these areas off, having to go back in and like erase all this stuff every time is kind of annoying. And it just takes time. This is getting like too close enough, but not too close. Okay. Alright, so I might tone that back just a little bit, and then I might also like pull that back on that temple, because I don't really need the temple to be in the shadow. Okay, so that's kind of adding to the like the contrast of the image just a little bit. So again, these are little things that you can do that maybe didn't show up in the rendering because they're actually not as realistic, but it can help make your image pop a little bit more. All right, let's maybe some other things. I usually like to think about drop shadows a little bit too to add some depth. So like underneath these nose, like these nose holder things, I feel like there would be a shadow. So I might do another little multiply layer with soft, small brush and kind of just add a little bit of shadow under there and then pull it back from the nose itself. I don't need it in the background, right? So again, like without and with adds just a little bit more depth to it. And because these are both multiply layers, I can add them together. If I added this multiply layer to my highlights layer, it would mess things up. So you just want to merge layers that are the same type. I'm going to save this really quick. Alright. So line work. Alright, another thing I've talked about a bunch, but we've never actually done is adding line work to a rendering. And I guess a bigger question about this is, why would you want to add line work to a beautiful rendering? There are a couple reasons. One is, the primary reason is to make it feel a little bit more like a sketch. And that does a couple things that we've already talked about, like actually, if someone looks at an image and it feels less complete, less finalized, they're more likely to be able to give you feedback on how it might change. So if it's earlier in the design process, then like, this is it, this is the final thing, adding some sketch lines can make it feel like it's still an in-process thing. Another reason to add lines would be to add more definition to surfaces. So one type of line I like to add is like a contour line. So I might come in here, oh man, that's not the right brush. There is, okay, that's good. To come in and like define these surfaces a little bit more with like a contour line of some kind. And you can go back in and obviously like hide them where it's not important to see them. That's this brush. I'm so used to having one that I can like move around here. And if that's too extreme, you can always tune it down a little bit. Actually, that line, I might want to take that like over the front of that surface too. Kind of splits it. Once again, it's sort of helping explain that there's like a chamfer there. Another thing that your line work can do is help pull your rendering off the background. So, man, this is where I really wish I could turn this a little bit more. Isn't there a way to rotate the canvas and?
Yeah.
Just
Use the
I have touch turned off.
Magnifying glass.
This guy?
Yeah, and then use like the sides of it.
You do?
You guys have it enabled, it looks like.
Maybe
mine has a
maybe I have it
Yeah,
off.
it's like, it's usually in between the outer and like the zoom one.
Okay. It's like I know I've seen that before. Where would it be? Brush process, brush, canvas, system. Oh, good thing to talk about while I'm looking at this. What size do I usually use? This probably just opened at whatever size I saved the rendering, but I usually use 11 by 17 at 150 ppi. No, it's not hotkeys. It's not the lagoon. I don't want to go back. Enable canvas rotate. Okay. Alright, so it should be... Did it say I have to, like, restart? Is it R? No. You know what? Screw it. I'll just do it as best I can. As best I can. Alright, so I might want to add lines. I really want to get this line down on the bottom here. Like, get that to go all the way sort of around and across. And this is where it's easy to want to spend like all day trying to get exactly the right line, which is super fun. Like, how close can we get to doing that in one go? Probably not very close.
So is this where you like a little bit of tails?
You could. Yeah, you definitely could. You don't want to go crazy with the tails, but that's not even like the whole thing. If only you could work lines on paper this way, right? I usually work them like one at a time. You can also like stroke a selection line in Photoshop, which is sometimes helpful. I really don't like how that turned out. Anyway, adding an outline to your sketch can make a big difference. and help it like pull it off the page a little bit more. We're getting close, guys.
This is a dark outline.
Yeah, this is dark. You can do. It depends on like your object too. Like this is a light object and a light background, so a dark outline kind of makes sense. But that's not always going to be the most beneficial. I thought one of these was spacebar. Yeah. And it can be kind of tricky on a rendering too, because everything else looks like pretty perfect. And there are, with like ellipses and things, you could use some of the like the guide tools. Sometimes that's helpful. And usually I'll add more than I think I might need, and then I can always like go back and erase the things that I don't really want.
So what's, I guess one thing I'm confused about is when to use like, just like the normal Keyshot rendering and trust that versus like doing something like that. Like for a rendering for like your portfolio, would you like, is it better to do something like this, or is it better to use Keyshot?
Good question. I would say, geez, what do we do? It depends on what part of the process you're showing. So like if you're showing, let's say in this project, I've sort of set on this final direction if the geometry is completely set in stone and I'm not making any other decisions about the design process. I'm really just showing off my final design. Probably don't need sketch lines. Probably don't want sketch lines. You want to emphasize how you can make an amazing render of a thing. If you're at a part in your design process where most of the decisions have been made, like it's relatively final, but you're still messing with things like maybe the profile of how this chamfer works. Like maybe one of your concepts, you have this little step out, it's padded and it steps back in. Another one shows a bunch of different like sections that, I don't know, have their own pattern or shape. Those are probably good details to bring some of the sketch lines back into, because it shows that those are still the parts of the design that can change. Yeah, and in that case too, like you might not want to put sketch lines on the part of your project that aren't going to change. Just put them on the parts that are going to change.
Okay.
And a lot of times too, those sketch lines aren't something you add after the fact. You would use the rendering as an underlay, and you're just sketching on top of your image new things. And actually, I have an example of that I can show you.
Okay, that's something, because I want to add my worker to my portfolio, but like, obviously I don't have any of like the locking mechanisms yet, and I don't want people to look at it and be like, well, how the hell does this thing work? So I was like, obviously I should probably add like sketch lines and stuff too.
Yeah, I think that would help. And the big ones really to add are the outline and pretty much any place that you would add like a dark line in a real sketch. So where like that ant, apparently touch, cool. Like if an ant walking on the front surface here would disappear to the back. That's a good place to put a sketch line too. Alright, I'm trying to think if there are other things. I would probably add some sort of line around the bottom of these lenses, and if not a black line, like that's probably a good candidate for some sort of highlight down there that you could then go in after the fact and like chase away the parts of it that you want to kind of fade out, like it's just a highlight on the bottom edge, right? Edges are probably the most important thing to pay attention to when you're doing like this sketch stuff. And you don't even have to get like that close. Like that alone is probably enough to make this make this happen. I could probably put one on this top edge here, and maybe even like right over there. Okay, so that's kind of like the basics, and really within 15-20 minutes of sketching on top of a rendering, you can get something that looks significantly different. So let's see like before and after here. I'm gonna just make an extra and combine these layers. Okay, so like before, and the line work is a little bit messier than it would be, and after. Let me try it with my stupid right hand. Right? It's subtle, especially when you're doing the changes. Like every change you make is like, did that do anything? But it can make a big difference.
It definitely makes it seem like it's just like a concept.
Yeah.
Right? It's like cheating.
Yeah.
We're all about that. So anyway, that's like my tips and tricks for you guys. I know I've been holding that carrot for a while. It's really not that hard to take a good, mediocre, good, even great rendering and make it feel more like an ID sketch kind of thing. So I'm gonna just save this. Actually, I'm not gonna save it. I'm gonna unmerge. How do I like go back here? You know what? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I'm just gonna save it. Okay, so I have one other thing for you guys who are here this late. Let me see.